What's the craziest crime you or somebody in your family has committed? Last year, my psychotic mother burned down my childhood home that her, my dad, my niece, my sibling, and sibling's partner lived in because she believed my dad was cheating on her. Despite no evidence, and this was not the first time she accused my dad of cheating with no evidence. Effectively, she destroyed everything we had built and kept in that home, along with my dad's dog and my sister's cat. Then, after the fire, in what I can only construe as an act of desperation, she went to my bank and stole all of the money out of my accounts because she was secondary in the accounts. I was working on changing banks, but my new bank had yet to finalize the creation of my new account. Moral of the story is, take your parents off your bank accounts when you turn 18. She's now serving time in a county jail because she took a plea deal and got a reduced sentence, which I still believe was utter crap. She played the poor old lady act to the judge and he took pity on her that she did not deserve. This is the woman who eviscerated my self-esteem and made my life hell ever since I was born. She was toxic and cruel, never told me the truth about anything, and is a greedy, manipulative person. I feel no shame in saying that I do not care about her. She's lost any right to my love and respect. Guess burning bridges took on a literal meaning for her. Story 2. My parents' horse got loose and somebody hit and ended it. The horse disposal people wanted some relatively reasonable amount of money to come pick up, but my parents were like, screw that. Hendergle, load that crap up on the flatbed and find somewhere to dump it. Me. Okay, sure, Pops. Calls friend. Me. Hey, wanna go dump a horse somewhere? Friend. Sure, I've nachos. Me. Cool. Friend. Cool. So, friend and I got even more spiked than usual and took my parents' flat truck bed out and tried to winch the horse up onto it. Turns out you really can't winch a horse onto a flatbed. It's not the winching that's the problem so much as the 5-foot lift up to the edge. We messed up a lot of that horse trying, though. Attempt number 2. We went home and built a big ramp out of plywood and 4x4s. It took most of a day and half a dime bag of grass. We argued a lot about whether or not we should bevel the part of the 4x4s that touched the ground. Final decision. Neither of us knew how to do that, so we opted for no bevel. Back at the horse, we wrapped the winch line around the head this time. We didn't quite Mr. Gooseberry. Long may he gallop in the heavenly fields. But it wasn't pretty. Nothing about that horse is pretty. But that bit in particular was remarkably not pretty. We decided to go with our original idea. Latch the front hooves together with a rope. Small problem. We'd cut the rope at some point. Neither of us could remember why or who did it, but nothing for it. We had to go home. Finding more rope required smoking half a grass, which I think is quite reasonable given the task we were set to do. Back at the horse again. Our engineering marvel worked. We had some initial worry that we would pull one or both of the horse's forelegs out of its socket, but apparently horse sinew has quite a bit of tensile strength. We used tie-down straps to latch the horse and ramp to the flatbed, initiating a discussion about why we hadn't used those in place of rope, leading to an argument over whether or not that would have worked, leading to an awkward hostile silence as we drove around the end of South Dakota looking for a place where we could dump a horse. I'm sure there were many places one could dump a horse in the middle of rural South Dakota. Strangely enough, though, we were both feeling a little paranoid. Every car that passed us was a plainclothes cop car. Every person standing out in their field was heading straight to their house to report us as soon as we went around the bend. Finally, we found a field in the Black Hills National Forest that looked like a good spot. It had trees, which we thought the horse would like, and there was a nice parking area next to a snowmobile trailhead. Goose had never liked snowmobiles, so the idea of his skeleton scaring the crap out of some ski-doer coming off the trail seemed like something that would have appealed to the old fella. We backed the truck a little ways into the ferns next to the trail. Then we used to come along to pull the horse off the flatbed. About a mile into the way home, friend said, "Does your horse have tattoos?" And I was like, "It's a horse, not a chief petty officer in the merchant marine. Why would it have tattoos?" Well, apparently some horses have tattoos, according to friend. It's how they identify them if they're stolen. Note, subsequent research revealed that this was usually only something done with thoroughbreds, which her horse was definitely not. Back at the horse again, I think they put him on the lip, inside, says friend. Have you ever pulled back the lip of a horse to look for tattoos? Worst, never have I ever. There were no tattoos, but then friend says, it's probably one of those tattoos that only lights up under UV. But then most of the grass had worn off, but there was that tiny bit of paranoia still holding on for dear life. What if there's a UV light lip tattoo in your horse, Hendergle? They're going to catch you for sure. Nobody's going to go looking for horse lips in the woods, friend. And that's how illegally dumping an animal in federal property is the craziest crime I or anybody in my family have ever committed. Story 3. When I was a young teen, the boys from the neighborhood and I loved playing pinball and video games at our local bowling alley. Problem was, we didn't have enough money to enjoy our new habit. We decided to do something about that little problem. We started with a very rudimentary system. We actually scotch taped a piece of thread to a quarter and were able to fish it up and down a couple times before the string would break or the tape would give out. This worked fairly well, but we wanted and needed more. Our next plan was a little more professional. We somehow concocted a scheme to make quarters. A few lessons in science class had actually stuck, and we realized that we needed something to fool the coin mechanism in the pinball machine into thinking that whatever it was we made our quarters with was an actual quarter. We ended up deciding that lead would be our material of choice. We used lead for a couple of reasons. A couple of the guy's fathers were avid hunters, even reloaded his own shells. Because of this, he had a burner set up in his shop to melt down lead. Another reason is that lead is not magnetic. Science. We made a mold out of plaster and used the burner to melt lead to make our quarters. But where to get more lead? One of us came up with a brilliant thought that tire weights were made of lead. Carrying screwdrivers and pliers, we scoured the parking lots of shopping centers. We would wander through and drop down out of sight between cars. Using the tools we had brought, we would manage to get the tire weights off with little trouble. We were in business. Our production line was soon up and running. We would melt lead, pour it into our mold, cool it, and then move into finishing our new quarter. The finishing process was crude but effective. We would snip off the burr where the lead was poured. We would then file down the edge, making sure it stayed mostly round. Using steel wool and a polishing cloth, we would then shine the quarters. Now comes the trial run. We went to the bowling alley with a few quarters to see if our harebrained scheme would actually work. And they went. The pinball machine lit up and was ready to be played. Success. We intensified our production, and soon we had bunches of quarters. We were thrilled. We could play video games anytime we wanted. Every day after school, you'd find us at the bowling alley, happily playing our games. But our downfall was soon to come. Never thought of the fact that someone might notice a bunch of fake quarters being used in their video games and pinball machines. It literally never crossed our early teenage minds. We just knew we were having a blast. One fateful day, we went to the bowling alley as usual. We started playing games, and soon, some men approached us. They started questioning us and accusing us. We were scared. One of the guys yelled, "Run!" And we took off as fast as we could. We made it to the doors and down the steps we went. We all lived in the same cul-de-sac, and that's the direction we headed. Running as fast as we could, we briefly split up. The men that were chasing us only followed one of us kids. We made the colossal mistake of running straight to his house and through the front door. From there, our crime spree ended. A few days later, I was in class when I was called to the office. When I got there, my father was sitting with a man I'd never seen before. He was wearing a black suit with a black tie. I had to go before the principal, my father, and a member of the United States Secret Service. Although they take the counterfeiting of U.S. currency very seriously, they understood that it was just a bunch of knucklehead kids making quarters to play video games. He actually told me that he was impressed with the quality of the quarters. He also said that they had recovered over $75 in fake quarters. We had made and used over 300 quarters. We had to make restitution for the money, and the charge was placed on our juvenile records. It was explained to us that if we kept our nose clean, the charge would be expunged. Luckily for me, I learned my lesson and stayed on the straight and narrow for the rest of my young adult life. And that, fellow Redditors, is how I was charged with counterfeiting U.S. currency. If that doesn't define the meaning of a crazy crime, I don't know what would. Story 4. Back in the mid-90s, I lived in a shared rented house in the north of England with our 4 ex-schoolmates. It was a bit of a den, right next to the bus station, so everyone called in on their way into the town for a cup of tea and same again on the way out. So it was always rammed, with people crashing everywhere. One morning, my girlfriend and I were woken up by the police coming into my bedroom. Illegally, they claimed to have pushed the door and it swung open, and telling us all to gather in the front room. I had my smoking stuff next to the bed. I assumed the police were there for substance, of course, so I had my stash before I came down. So we're all sitting in the lounge, hungover and that, and the policeman says, "So, who knows about the credit card?" We all just went, "What?" Because it wasn't what we were expecting. Except one of my housemates stands up and says, "No one else knows anything. It's me." And goes off with the police. Turns out a bank card had been delivered for a previous tenant, and then shortly after, a new PIN. My housemate had taken it and emptied the account of a load of cash. And what had he bought with the stolen cash? A gecko and a big fancy glass cabinet. He was struggling to pay his rent. We all were. But here was this massive green mother sitting there, sunning itself in her front room. All 6 or so of us just sat and looked at it as he was taken away. Story 5. Twin brothers boosted a car and robbed a 7-Eleven about half a mile from their house. They ditched the car 10 houses from theirs. How were they caught? Officers responded to an alarm triggered by the clerk. Officer, got an alarm here. What happened? Clerk, Tim and Tom came in and robbed the store. Officer, how do you know it was these guys? Clerk, they are 6'4" twins who come in every day. I know their shape and voice. The car 911 operator. 911, what is your emergency? Neighbor, was watching TV and two guys parked a car in front of my house. One guy got out with like a Windex bottle and cleaned all the door handles and door areas. Then opened the door and the other guy took the stuff and cleaned the inside areas. Then they ran up off the street. Dispatch, can you describe the two individuals? Neighbor, well, it was Tim and Tom, the twins that live up the street from me. They're like 6'4" and they're twins. Were they really that dumb? Story 6. Mine is incredibly stupid, but looking back, it reminds me of how actually crazy the whole situation was. When I was in 6th grade, my parents, mom plus stepdad, got married and moved to this very small, very religious, very tight-knit community. My life changed immeasurably that year. I absolutely hated my new school and all the people in it. So our morning routine was, parents get up at 6 a.m., wake me at 6:30 a.m. Both parents are out the door by 6:45 a.m., and I have to catch my bus at 7:15 a.m. Well, 11-year-old me figured out that I could just not catch my bus, and my parents, both working demanding jobs, would not be home until 3 hours after I usually got home, so they'd never know. The first day I skipped school was easy. By week 2, I realized I'd have to go back for exams, especially the state exam, which determined if you got to move to the next grade, and obviously, the school would want to know why I was absent. So I devised a plan wherein I called the school pretending to be my mother and told them my poor daughter had mononucleosis, mono, and would be in and out as she felt better. I also asked them to please change my contact number to my home phone. That way I could intercept any phone calls. And thus began the 6 weeks where I went to school only ever on days that I had exams. Unbeknownst to me, one of my teachers wrote a note with my report card that was mailed to our house. It said she was so proud of me for keeping up with my schoolwork despite being sick and out of class so often. I was in 3rd period when I got called to the office to find my vice principal, two very angry parents, and a truancy officer waiting for me. I had to go to court because I'd missed so many days and was given community service as punishment. I was also sent to in-school suspension, ISS, for the remainder of the year. Still on my criminal record, although since I was underage when it occurred, the details are sealed. And I was 100% convicted of truancy. Story 7. It's not a bad crime or anything, but it was illegal at the time. So in Germany, up until a few years ago, we still had a general draft for the army. And a generation ago, it was very hard to get out of it. My uncle was a hardcore pacifist, so going to the army wasn't an option for him. But being accepted as a conscientious objector at the time basically required you to be a devout Christian and use the Bible as an argument for why you couldn't end another human. And my uncle was also an atheist. He couldn't realistically object, didn't want to go to the army, and didn't want to go to jail too. So he waited. He got sent his draft notice, passed the physical, and got a letter telling him to report to X company under Sergeant Y. He wrote back a reply on rose-colored paper, scented with perfume, but how much he was looking forward to serving under the strong leadership of Y, promising to obey every one of his orders and that he can't wait to experience life in the barracks together with so many strong and muscular men. He was declared unfit for service shortly after. Story 8. I was in middle school, 13 to 14, and my buddy and I snuck out of the house to go cause mischief. We did this almost every weekend, and we really only snuck out because we knew we shouldn't be. The worst we ever did was TP our other friend. Other than that, we just rode our bikes around. Except, one time we met up with a couple girls that my friend knew. We were going around our town and tipped a porta potty, put someone's patio furniture in their tree. Stupid crap like that. My buddy thought he could show off his muscles by pulling a mailbox out of the ground. I said he couldn't, and I was right. To one-up him, I pulled the mailbox right out of the ground, and we laughed like little girls as set it on the homeowner's front step. Not 10 minutes later, cops rolled around with their spotlight on. Found us, got the mailbox, and brought us home. My dad made me go back to the house, and the mailbox was in the ground already. He made me knock and apologize to the homeowner, who happened to be a 90-year-old woman with cancer. That strained me up real quick. I never did stuff like that again. Only later did I find out what I did was a crime, and I didn't feel like living that life anymore. Story 9. My uncle was a small leader in Northern California in the 90s. He had a compound out in Gold Country, had to drive through 3 gates with guards to get to his house. I never questioned it as a kid, just enjoyed heading up so I could fish in the stocked bass pond, which also had snapping turtles. As a line of defense, he'd take me out shopping at the mall with a film canister that he'd take hits off of occasionally, shadowed by some bodyguards. One time we were out for a ride in his Corvette going well over 100 and got tagged by highway patrol. He talked his way out of the ticket, told the officer he was showing off for his nephew and got carried away. The officer thought it was hilarious. He told me he was lucky since he had a ton of illegal stuff in the trunk and would have made a run for it. He got arrested when I was 15. It was a full-blown feds descended upon the compound in helicopters and swung through the windows with flashbangs. The whole nine. He was arrested, and since, if he snitched on anyone above him, he was, very bluntly, a doomed man. He took the rap, was extradited to Lee and VA to serve a bit over 10 years. All he asked for while he was there was protein powder. He got prison ripped, and apparently harmed someone with a sock full of quarters for cutting in front of him at the payphone. At some point in my life, all four of my uncles on both sides, plus my dad, have spent time in prison for substance-related offenses, but this particular uncle takes the cake. Story 10. My mom set a dude on fire. When I was young, I had a babysitter named Chris. It was the uncle of my two best friends, sisters Abby and Becca. It was also cruel. Liked to do things to me in front of them, make them listen to my cry and scream. Nothing physical, I should mention. More psychological. Anyway, I didn't tell anyone about it. And in fact, only learned the story about 2 years ago. But it turns out that my best friends did. I told my mom and she was mad. Soon after that, there's a party at my friend's parents' house. My mom goes and sees Chris. He's all nice to her. They're outside in the backyard. She starts kind of joking around, roughhousing, messing with him. Grabs some lighter fluid and sprays some on him. Ha ha ha, just a joke. She lights a match. You wouldn't do it, would you? And she lights him on fire. According to my mom, he was put out quickly, so he was fine. But she told him that's what it's like when you're scared for your life. And then she left. Apparently, he flew back to Florida the next day. Sounds like she gave him a warm welcome. Story 11. My sister-in-law worked in a ski hill. One week, there was a promotion by a company where they would blow up big inflatables, like the big gorillas you see in car lots. She'd seen them blow them up and deflate them for days, so she knew what the deflated ones looked like. One day, she was leaving work, and one of these deflated mascot thingies was right behind her car. My sister-in-law has never stolen anything in her life. But at that moment, she decided out of the blue that she wanted that blow-up. She plopped it in the bag and drove home. When I came to visit a couple weeks later, she was freaking out about it. She asked me if I wanted it, just to get the evidence out of her house. That is the story of how I came to own a 2-story high inflatable cow. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 12. So, before I was born, my parents were apparently going through some tough financial issues and were facing eviction if they couldn't come up with a certain amount of money by a certain date. My father decided the best way to handle the situation would be to rob a bank. So the story, as I was told, goes like this. My father walked into a small bank with a ski mask on and his hand in his pocket. I went up to a teller and handed her a bag, telling her he was robbing the place. He had a weapon and exactly how much money he wanted, which turned out to be exactly the amount he needed to avoid eviction. He got the money, apologized to the teller, and then left. He was never caught. The next part of the story is a little weird, and even I have a hard time believing it, but I know my dad. He's no liar. Apparently, a year or two later, my dad went back to the same bank he robbed every day until he found the teller he robbed previously. He walked up without a mask and handed her an envelope and immediately left the area. In the envelope was the exact amount of money he stole and a note saying that the money was for the teller, a gift, and how incredibly sorry he was for scaring her when he robbed the place. Again, he was never caught. My father is a very honorable man who was raised in poverty on an Indian reservation. Because of the cruelty he went through, both at home and at school, residential schools have a bit of history to them. He vowed that his kids would never have to go through what he did. I truly believe that robbing the bank was a result of that vow, but emotionally hurting that woman at the bank really ate away at him. So he risked getting arrested to try and make it right. Story 13. My dad was traveling through Tibet in his 20s. I don't know exactly where, but he came across what was evidently a secret Chinese military installation. Being my dad, he decided to take some photos and was somehow spotted. Armed guards, presumably shouting Chinese expletives, started running up the hill toward him. He turned around and hightailed it back over the hill to the road where he hid himself in an irrigation pipe. He had to hide there for several hours while they drove up and down the road looking for him. It makes me wonder what the hell was in that base. But it could just be that they thought he was a spy. Anyway, eventually he paid a passing farmer to hide him in his cart, and then he made it to the nearest town. After spending the night in his rented room, he packs up to get on the bus out there. Small problem. He happens to look out of his window and sees a Chinese soldier standing by the bus. I will always admire this bit of quick thinking. He decides to shave off his quite big beard. It evidently worked because he's here snoring in bed right now and not rotting in whatever Chinese equivalent there is to the gulag. Story 14. I'm late to this party, but I have a fun one. In the latter half of the 18th century, the French and British used Native Americans to supplement their own forces in the struggle for North America. I have ancestors who had a farm in upstate New York when I was in the frontier. The parents were ended by a Huron war party, and their son, who was just a child at the time, was taken by the Hurons and raised as one of their own. Years passed, and a time of relative peace settled between the French-backed Hurons and the British. Word trickled down to York, now Toronto, that there was a young white man running around the woods with Indians to the north. The British garrison at Fort York sent an officer and a trooper to an embassy through Huron country, going from village to investigate. They found the young man, my many times great-grandfather, and persuaded him to come with them back to British territory. They didn't remember his name, so they gave him the first name of the officer and the last name of the trooper for the sake of giving him some identity as an Englishman. Then the American Revolution broke out. The young man joined one of the ranger units the British Army fielded because he knew how to fight in forests and lived off the land. Obviously, the British lost the war, but anyone who fought for them was given land in Canada at the end of hostilities. He was granted land on the north shore of Lake Ontario. One of the conditions of getting the free land was that you had to clear a certain portion of it and make a certain amount of communal road along one edge of your property in a given amount of time. All the new settlers in the area worked together to get this done, and one older neighbor recognized my many times great-grandfather from when he was a boy. "Your name's not so-and-so. It's such and such. You're the spitting image of your father." "Oh," says my many times great-grandfather. He then wrote to the British authorities. "To whom it may concern, I fought in the most recent war against the Americans. My name is such and such. Here's my former commander's name and address. He'll vouch for me. I believe I'm entitled to free land. As luck would have it, I own a farm and the lot behind me is unclaimed. Did I have that one?" And they gave it to him. 200 and some odd years later, the record of that petition and land grant still exist. He used his real name to defraud the British government out of a second land grant for the same military service. I've always thought that was a cool story. Story 15. My dad had this really weird habit of stealing signs, which is manifested in a bizarre way twice. The first requires a minor backstory in that his family has lived in our small town since it was founded, and as such, we have a street named after us. My dad insists that because the street sign has got his name on it, it's technically his property, so he annually steals it. The second, I'm not even quite sure how he pulled off. You know those giant highway signs that direct you to what lane you need to be in for your turnoff? Where I'm from, they're huge and green. Somehow, this madman has managed to get one into his shed overnight by himself. This thing could easily weigh a literal ton. I'm so impressed. He also acquired other strange things, such as a Ford factory sign, also one of the giant ones, several billboards, commemorative plaques, carousel horses, and a bunch of other miscellaneous. Whenever he runs out of space, he just builds a new shed. He is also not allowed in Canada, but won't tell me why. Story 16. This one is a bit lighthearted, but I technically may have committed a war crime. I started doing stand-up comedy before my second deployment, and when we were shipped out to Afghanistan, I didn't want to lose the momentum that I'd gained, so I would do shows in the chow hall, and I ordered a bunch of books about how to succeed at stand-up. One of them suggested practicing crowd work, where you talk to the crowd by asking about their job, where they're from, etc. After a raid, we detained some combatants and had to hold them for a few days before the intelligence guy could come pick them up. So when I was on my guard shifts, I'd have an interpreter and I'd ask things like where they were from and what they did for a living. And then I'd try to make jokes about it. I wasn't a schmuck, but it wasn't all that funny either. After they got picked up and the intelligence guy started interrogating them, they said, "We told the other guy." And then my commander got an angry phone call about how I technically performed unconventional interrogation and should never do it again. I haven't done crowd work since. Story 17. My father-in-law hired his son to end his second wife. This was several years ago and they were never prosecuted despite investigation. They recently reopened the case, so we're all waiting to see where it goes this time. My best friend has a bunch of crazy stories, so I'll pick one at random. One day, he, his wife, and multiple kids were eating dinner at his mother's house when a SWAT team kicked in the door and pointed at all of them. They were looking for his wife's brother and for some reason thought he would be there. Turns out my friend hates the guy and took umbrage with weapons being pointed at his family. He tells the SWAT team that he'll find the schmuck and to wait a second while he grabs some stuff. He goes to his room and returns wearing a bulletproof vest, yelling, "Follow me!" This dude proceeds to a house where he kicks the door off the hinges, walks in, blasts the TV, and demands to know where Dylan, name changed to protect the guilty, is. There are multiple dealers in this house and users, startled to say the least. A girl there claims she knows where Dylan is, so he takes her and forces her into the car. This is in full view of the SWAT team, by the way. The girl directs him to a second den. He kicks the door and it proves sturdier, so he blows it apart and enters a room with weapons drawn on him. He demands to know where Dylan is. It turns out Dylan owes these people money, so they tell him where they think he is, which is a third house. On their way there, with the girl still in the car, he gets a phone call from Dylan saying he's at the said house and to please not hurt him. Apparently, word was getting around that my boy was on the warpath. At the third house, the people shove Dylan out the door and SWAT, still following, arrests him. Apparently, this whole thing amused them to no end, and they're in tears laughing at my friend and give absolutely no care about what he did to get the guy. So he's driving the girl back, and halfway to where he got her from, he tells him that if he pulls over, she'll have intimacy with him right then and there. He pulls over and drags her out of the car and tells her, "I have a wife and kids, you witch." He then goes home and no one presses any charges. The next day, he straps on his tools and goes to the first two houses, and to their astonishment, he replaces their doors. Story 18. Craziest ones I'm willing to talk about. Spent 3 days with a chick from somewhere in Mexico. Met her at a friend's dad's house. She just hung out with us. She didn't speak English, drank and smoked with us. Happened to meet up with a bilingual friend who struck up a conversation and learned she had been bought by a friend of mine's dad. He, the son, was one of us. She wanted to be deported and go home. This guy's dad was always sketchy, but no one was aware of trafficking issues back then like they are today. We dropped her off at INS. We weren't willingly breaking the law, but I'm sure we would have caught charges if we had been busted or something while she was with us. His dad did time over that before it was all over. To be clear, intimacy wasn't involved with this situation on our part. It was super tense and weird having her with us. All we knew was we showed up at this guy's house and he gave us $500 and said, "Take her away from here." I hate to think what all happened before that. Another unwitting crime. Pulled a guy out of a river that tried to end it all by drowning. Did CPR. He said his mom is suffering in New Orleans and he can't get there in time, so I take him there. 4-hour trip by car. I'm home the next week and his picture is on the news. They caught up with the guy later, or so I heard. In high school, I drove to Arizona in search of good grass because our area was dry. I don't even know why Arizona. Found a different one instead and went AWOL for a week tripping. There's more, but I won't tell it here. All this was back in the 90s, so the statute of limitations and all that, but it's still better to leave some things in the past. Story 19. It's only the craziest because I was so young. As for my dad, he just has a long rap sheet of driving under the influence. However, when I was in second grade, I started breaking into houses in my neighborhood and vandalizing them with my friends because we didn't know what for rent meant. It was just empty houses. We eventually made our way to stealing mail also, all at the same time. My mom found out about it, called the cops and told me I was under house arrest because what I did was bad, and she told me a drone in the sky was watching me all the time, and if I left the yard, they would come and take me to jail. My friend who was doing this with me, her dad was a resource officer. I don't know what they're called, lol. Out of jail and took her with him and made her sit in the classroom and told her it was her cell. I ended up doing yard work for an old lady I stole some silverware from. Her name was Gretchen, and she was the sweetest lady I'd ever met. I didn't mind planting flowers and such with her because she was always so nice and fed me. Story 20. Definitely not the most exciting or dramatic story in this thread, but here it goes. My aunt, dad's sister, married a really nice guy when I was about 9 years old. I come from a family of mostly white-collar, educated people, attorneys, dentists, etc. So when my aunt married this guy who was a very successful attorney, incredibly intelligent, kind, and everything you'd want, we were all thrilled. Things were going good for a very long time. He was successful, that side of the family joined a country club, and my aunt and uncle lived a comfortable life. My dad, who's also an attorney, called me one day in 2010 to tell me that my uncle had been disbarred for double billing. We were disgusted and appalled because there was no reason for him to do this. He was already a millionaire, so why double bill? They got disbarred again a few years later for the same exact thing. I guess my uncle never learned his lesson. I have no idea why he did it. Not just once, but twice. He had more than enough money to live comfortably ever after, retire, and still maintain their country club lifestyle with my aunt. I believe he lost his law license over it as well. Recently, while doing some research on Ancestry.com, I was asking my dad questions about him. Lol. Dad told me they had to sell their mansion because my uncle had a massive stroke and can't walk stairs. My dad is also disgusted with him that he refuses to even talk to my aunt or uncle. There are other factors involved as well, because of his terrible mistakes as an attorney. Why? Because A, He knew better. B, could have retired. And C, did it at least twice and got caught. The guy's almost 80 too. I think he's in a wheelchair now. And my aunt and him had to downsize to a condo so he could move around in his wheelchair. I truly hope he gets better, but seriously, dude, quit breaking the law. Story 21. 16,000 comments deep, so probably no one will see this. My mom dated a real schmuck who was emotionally and physically cruel towards us. He bought an RV and a truck top camper. They were both parked at our house, but only he had the keys. Whenever anyone misbehaved, he would take some items of ours that was important to us and put it in the camper or RV. We never got the items back. They did this to my mom as well. A couple of years went by and the campers were still stuffed full of our things, along with a bunch of other stuff. I'm not entirely sure because we were never allowed in either one and never allowed to be around when he went into them. From the brief glances I had here and there, they were pretty well filled to the brim, order style. Eventually they broke up. He left and took his crappy campers full of our stuff to live on his sister's property. He stalked us and pestered us for at least 5 years after leaving. I think he would still drive by and even go into our yard for many years more. It was way less intense and just kind of became normal, I guess. I'm not exactly sure how long after he left this incident happened, but I would guess the first year, as that was when his stalking, pestering, and threatening behavior was the worst. As you can imagine, it was really stressful and traumatic for everyone. My mom definitely got the worst of it, as he would show up at her work and call her there. She eventually got a restraining order. Not that it did much. Anyway, my mom started getting really angry over everything he was putting us through. One night we came home and things were missing from her house, like TVs, a camcorder, and some other stuff. My mom called the police, who said that since they were married and despite a restraining order, there was nothing they could do about him coming into her house and stealing things. Throughout the time they dated and through the breakup, the police were absolutely worthless. It would hurt her. No charges. You provoked him. He would break in and steal things. Nothing we could do. He would call constantly, run her off the road, make threats, and all we got was, "You have no proof." I guess the cops refusing to help her was the last straw. I think my stepdad taunted her that he chucked the items in his camper. Anyhow, I'm a kid, so bedtime comes and nothing seems out of the ordinary. I go to sleep. I wake up in the morning and my mom has a bad dog bite in the back of her leg. She tells some story about a dog coming up behind her and biting her on the leg last night. I forget the story exactly, but it was fishy. Later that morning, the angry call started from my stepdad, and there was a visit from the cops. This was when I learned his camper is mysteriously caught on fire the night before. Campers catch on fire. Suspicious dog bite. I'm too scared to ask, but my mom, of course, denies it to the cops. There's no way to prove she was involved, so aside from my stepdad being angry and increasing the phone calls, nothing happens. My mom had to do wet-to-dry dressings for some time because she had a wound. It took months to heal, and she has a large scar. Fast forward many years, maybe 25 to 30, I finally worked up the courage to ask. That night, my mom put us all to bed, snuck out of her house, and burned his RVs to the ground. She was hiding in the bushes at some point. She must have gone too close to a stray dog's den of puppies. The mother dog locked her jaws onto my mom's calf and wouldn't let go. She said knowing he was going to stick her things in the RV one more time pushed her over the edge. She knew we were never going to see any of the stuff ever again, despite her asking repeatedly to return it. And asking proper legal channels never got her any help, so she just burned it all to the ground. If you ask me, that's one small piece of justice we ever got. Thanks, Mom. He's gone now, and I'm not the least bit sad. What a goddamn monster. Story 22. In 1970, my dad had a buddy who was living in Boston, Massachusetts, but wanted to move back home to hometown city, Ohio, but didn't have a car. So my dad and his friends said they'd road trip out to get him in Boston, party for the weekend, and drive back to Ohio. My dad said as they piled in the car to start their journey to Boston, they loaded a couple cases of drinks in the car, and their friend said he had a surprise for all of them. My dad's friend turned to them and each gave them a head of the good stuff, and said this would make the trip fly by. A few hours into the drive, they're tripping pretty hard and have had a couple drinks each at this point, and they get pulled over. The driver pulls over, my dad and his friends start freaking out and shove the empty bottles into the seats, and put their feet and jackets over the cases. The officer comes up to the window, knocks on it, and the driver rolls down the window and asks what's the problem. The officer asks if he knows how fast he was driving. My dad said they all immediately looked at one another with huge eyes and everyone was silent. My dad told me he was silently thinking, Jesus Christ, we had to have been doing 100. Scenery has been melting. The driver finally said no, and the officer looked every single one of them in the face. The officer said, "You were driving 10 miles per hour on a 65 miles per hour highway. Are you having car trouble or what?" His friend politely said, "No, sorry about that. Was just being extra cautious, you know?" And the officer looked at all of them again, shook his head, and told them to speed it up or get off the highway. My dad and his friends burst out laughing and crying as soon as the officer walked away, and they continued their journey and safely retrieved their friend in Boston and back to Ohio. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.